All right, hello everyone, and this is the week 5 lecture of the Revit course. So today I don't have a whole lot of information to go over, so hopefully it'll go a little bit quick, and there's actually not too much to see on the screen either. I just have the sample file open on the screen just so we have something that I can work with if I need it. So today the lecture and what I want to talk about is about how we organize our project, or the kind of information organization inside of a Revit project. So before I start talking specifically about the way Revit does it, I want to talk about how just CAD does it, or actually other applications do that. So when I'm talking about information organization, inside of CAD or even other applications, I'm really talking about organizing your drawing or whatever you're working on into layers. Right? So in CAD, you have layers. So you have a layer for walls, you have a layer for doors, you have a layer for windows. So this layering system becomes a method that you can group items together that are similar, or you want to have the same color, or you want them to print with the same line weight, or you want to be able to control their visibility. A variety of reasons for grouping together things into a layer and saying all of these things belong to this layer, and you give it some name, and then you have some kind of control over what that layer does and what it doesn't do. So this idea of organizing things into layers, it happens in, that happens in Illustrator or Photoshop. That same metaphor happens in lots of different programs, layers, because it's very, it's very easy to understand. And it actually is something that comes from, at least from CAD, it comes from back to the old days of drafting. They used to do what's called pin bar drafting, or when you were drafting things by hand, you would have a bar across the top of your drawing set where there were holes like loose leaf paper that you would put these sheets of paper down over, and you would build your drawing set up in layers. So you could see stuff and you could flip back and forth, and the pin bar would kind of keep everything held together in the right spot. So this notion, or this metaphor of using layers as a way of organizing your drawing in the computer comes actually from the way we would organize things outside of the computer into different sheets of paper so we can group things. And so what's really nice about this kind of layer system is that it's infinitely flexible, but in many ways that's the same downfall too, right? Because it is infinitely flexible, you never really have a common standard. If anybody's ever worked in more than one office, you'll know more than likely the chance of the layer standards being the same from one office to the next is almost none. There's no way that layers are kind of like opinions, right? Everybody has one. There's no set standards, even though there are some movements or some national CAD standards and things that kind of dictate what layer names should be. They're not so prescriptive that you can't violate them in some way. So finding, two things alike are very different. Or even, the way an architect might organize their layers into, say, windows, doors, and walls is different than, say, a 3D artist might organize their layers, where they might organize their layers into wood, glass, and metal, because they're applying materials via layer. So if you were to pass off your architectural model that was done with walls, windows, doors to the 3D modeler, chances are they may have to go through and rework everything to get it to match their standard and be able to be used in their system. So there's a lot of inconsistency in the system, and we have inconsistency. It makes it difficult for even within an office to figure out where somebody's put something or what the organization system is. Once you kind of know it, it makes sense and you can work with it, but there is some kind of ramp up time or translation time. If you're sharing files, this problem gets even harder. If you're sharing between offices, or like I say, across disciplines, this problem gets harder. So this metaphor of layers, while being very flexible, that's also its biggest downfall, is it's incredibly flexible. So it makes it difficult to use and transport from one place to another. So Revit takes a different approach, right? We've been working with it now for a few weeks, and so you've noticed I haven't ever talked about layers. Revit really doesn't have a layer system per se. It has something like it. It has a different organization system, but we don't call it layers. In Revit, we call it, it's part of that hierarchy of of items that I've talked about a few times in class. Right at the very top, we have category. Well, the categories of your objects are really what the organizational system is for all of our information. Everything has to fall into a category, and it just happens that in Revit, all the categories are predetermined for you. There's no way for you to actually alter the categories that exist within the system. The Revit project defines all the categories from the start, and it defines every single category. So you don't make them on the fly. Every project has every category in it, and then every object has to find one of those categories to go into. And then based on that category, that's how it's grouped. So, and the categories are typically by function. So Revit provides a much more consistent experience because as a user, you can't really control what the categories are. They are predetermined. So you get rid of all of that kind of labor of needing to, when you're authoring an object like in CAD, you have to make sure you're on the wall layer, make sure that's all set correctly, and then draw your object. In Revit, you just pick the wall tool, it automatically goes to the wall category, and you don't have to worry about whether it made it to the right spot or not, or having somebody put a bunch of exterior walls on an interior wall layer. That's just not going to happen. You're not going to have the wrong placement of an object because the category is predetermined. As you place the object, it knows what category it's supposed to go on. So it makes for a much more consistent experience and less chance for error, almost no chance for error, at least when making most normal objects. Of course, if you're making custom objects, there could be errors, but most of the time, there's not going to be an option for making errors. So this automatic organization system that we call categories, you can see what the categories are. If I go to manage here, we can expose it here. And under object styles, I'm going to open this dialog box and let me make it a little bit bigger on the screen so we can see it. Oh, maybe I can't make it bigger. Oh, there we go. Okay, and I'll move it over to the side because I'll probably put my face down in the corner here. All right. So here you see all of the categories that exist in our project. And I happen to be showing all of my categories now, but I can filter that list because the list can get long. So you can filter it by your discipline. So we have model categories, and then we also have the annotation things. So all of the annotation things that we could possibly have are listed here. And then the analytical things, we won't really ever talk about those, but that if you were doing an analysis on a structural analysis, you would use these categories. And the imported categories are if I bring in a DWG, the layer gets turned into a category in and of itself. So this will only really populate as we put in DWG files. So in this case, you see I have a roofing detail DWG in this project, and these are the layers that are inside of that file. So that's what we're looking at there. So most of the time, we're really concerned about the first two tabs here, the model objects and the annotation objects. So you see the category basically gets whatever it is. So let me go down to walls because it's something we're familiar with, right? So here I have walls, and then the category of walls then has two ways that it can be seen. It can either be seen projected or it can be seen cut. So like in a plan, you're cutting the wall. In an elevation, you're projecting the wall. Or if a wall was below the cut plane, it would be projected. So you see we're listing the line weight for the projection item and the line weight for the cut item. So if you wanted thicker walls for your cuts or whatever, you could change that, and so then every wall in your project would get a thicker cut. So if I change this value to be something else, change it to be 5, all of my walls would get thicker in my project. So this is just like I'm changing the layer value. So it's very similar to that. It's just that everything that's listed here is predetermined by the system. I don't get to choose what categories there are, right? So categories are not changeable by the user in any way. And then finally over here we have, what color are you going to use for those things and what line are you going to use. And you can actually predefine materials for some things. So you'll see some things like a railing or something, for example, might say, for its material, if you don't explicitly define it, it'll say by category. Well, it can be defined here. So it picks up whatever the category, whatever the material is here, if you have something defined. So in this case, there's a few here: default floor, default roof, default wall. So you can get materials assigned, so it just picks up a material as you place something in, unless you change it specifically for that family. So this alternative adds a real rigid consistency, which now we're kind of in the opposite camp, right? If it's really flexible, that's great. But if it becomes too rigid and solid, then that becomes a little harder to work with. So every object that you make, it has to have some kind of category. So obviously you can run into trouble where you don't have something to place something into. And there is kind of a catch-all called generic that you can throw stuff into. If you can't find anywhere else for it to go, it can always be a generic thing. But this can lead to trouble down the road if you're trying to schedule things and things like that. If you put a bunch of things into generic, then you try to make a schedule of those things, and all of a sudden you've got way too many things in there. So it becomes a little bit challenging, right? And one of the other things that kind of predefining these categories allows the system to do, this is part of what makes it possible for Revit to interpret design intent. So I've talked about design intent a bunch, and we're talking about things like connecting roofs or walls to roofs, or making L shapes in walls. Because these things get a category and get it automatically assigned, and you don't have to worry about it, the guys who are programming, or the guys and gals who are programming Revit, can work at a deeper system level to create relationships between elements, so things will behave the way you want them to. So even that goes into even making it possible for you to, to make a family, say, that only goes on the face of a wall, because they know that those two things will exist, and there will never be, you can never call a wall something else. You can make something that looks for this category of thing called wall. So it's easier to kind of build this design intent behavior and make that communication more clear and more possible, right? So on the upside, this information organization that we have inside of Revit is, because it's very rigid and predetermined, it makes it possible for you to focus on worrying about design, not worrying about, is my layer right, is all of that stuff correct. That stuff is really kind of set up ahead of you, out of the box by the guys who are programming Revit, but by Autodesk. We predetermine how you're going to organize your drawings. You don't have to spend time figuring that out. I know when I was in an office, we'd spend all kinds of time figuring out what is our layer standard going to be, and we talk about it and have meetings. I don't have to do that when I'm working inside of Revit. I know this is the layer, these are the categories that I have to work with, right? And that also helps when I'm sharing my information from one office to the next. If you're working in one office and you've worked in Revit, you know the categories, and when you go to the next office and they're working in Revit, the categories are exactly the same. There's no need to relearn. You know where all of these things should be. They go on certain things. This also helps when you're sharing models from one office to another, because you're collaborating. You don't have to spend time relayering or doing things, because you know where all of these pieces are. So this kind of really rigid consistency makes the drawings easier to work with, or makes the models easier to work with as you share them between disciplines or share them between offices. These things get very, very, simple to modify or to work with. The other thing that it does is, I no longer have that, because the organizational system isn't controlling things like material necessarily, and those kind of things. Materials are applied in a different way, so I don't have to relayer something if I'm going to use that model for a different purpose. This organizational system is going to serve both needs, because because it's rigid. There are other methods to kind of handle applying material and things like that. So it's kind of baked into the system of the whole program of how you're going to work with it. It's not just one way of organizing something. right? So, and I guess it's also worth mentioning too that of course you need to have control over discrete parts or something like that. So while the categories are very, very flexible, there's also, if you can see all these have little pluses beside them, there are also subcategories within a category, which allows you more discrete control over something. So, the stairs may have a certain representation, but all the parts inside of the stairs can be treated differently. So subcategories are something that is possible for a user to make modifications to. So if there's something that you need discrete control over for some reason, say in a door or whatever, like I don't know that there's a hardware there's not a hardware item in here. So if you had door handles or something and you wanted to be able to independently work with those, turn them on and off, or control their line weight, I can add a new subcategory. I think I might have to have this selected here. Let's see. Yeah, so make a new subcategory of doors. I can make a new one, and that will appear. So now I have some control. So if I get items to go on to this hardware subcategory, which that's a different lecture to how things arrive to those subcategories. But for now, the important thing to know is that while the category is rigid and specific, the subcategories can be set by the user. Now, of course, this introduces the opportunity for the same problems you have with layers, right? I might have named this hardware, but somebody else might come along and make something like this, HDWR period, and now I have both of those, and one's hardware, that one could be hardware too. So there still needs to be some kind of consistency and some kind of understanding of how you use subcategories. Typically, I don't ever use subcategories. I just use the ones that are here, and I don't really add subcategories. But that's not always the rule, and families can bring them in. So that can get out of control if you're not careful, right? So there's definitely upside to it, but of course there is downside in that, same with layers. The flexibility is the upside and the downside. Revit, the rigidity is the upside and the downside. If you have to have something, if you happen to have something that doesn't fit into a specific category, you have to find something like generic and just kind of stuff it in there. So there are some downsides to this as well. And another kind of bigger downside, or one of the things, is that I have no way of really organizing things that don't have, any kind of logical connection to each other. So when I'm working with layers, sometimes I can put a bunch of stuff onto the existing layer, right? I could put walls, doors, windows, fixtures, and all that. I could throw all that onto a layer called existing, and then I could have a bunch of stuff that I'm tearing out, and I could put walls, windows, doors, fixtures onto a layer called demolition, and then define those two layers, just those two layers, to look a certain way, because I want all those objects, whether they're windows, doors, or whatever, to all look the same. So being able to, kind of group stuff in a way that's different is something that you can't do in Revit. So, for my example of existing, demolished, and new stuff, it's handled there's another method to handle that in Revit, which is maybe a little bit more complex than just throwing everything onto a layer. So that's another kind of disadvantage of Revit, is that the category system, the organization system in Revit is this, there's no real way to organize things that maybe don't necessarily belong together. There are some organizations that another way you might want to organize something is if you're working on a multifamily project. You might have, units that you want to organize together, and you could group those in some way in with layers, perhaps in AutoCAD, but Revit, you use a tool called groups, and AutoCAD has groups and blocks as well. So Revit does have ways to group items that aren't alike. So we can group items, or we can, if I go to a floor plan, I can show this maybe a little better. So I can say grab a whole bunch of stuff. If my, for some reason it's not working, I don't know why. All right, so anyhow, there is a tool for grouping things. I don't know why I'm not getting anything. All right, so that tool is to create groups. So you can grab a bunch of different things. So there's an example of a toilet room that is grouped. Or there's another system of grouping things called assemblies. Yeah, that one's assembly. So an assembly can have unlike things put together and created, and it's slightly different than a group in the fact that then you can take assemblies and make specific views of those assemblies, and those things can be fabricated. So assemblies are more for grabbing things that you want to put into a fabrication workflow than necessarily just kind of an organizational grouping of things. So those are a couple of ways that we can have other kind of groupings or organizations within Revit. So really, that's kind of that's the gist of this week 5 lecture, is that Revit uses something different than layers to organize its stuff. The stuff that it's using, or the tool that it's using, is this thing called categories, and we manage that through this object styles dialog box. And this is set in stone. It makes for our drawings very consistent and makes you be able to focus on design rather than being focused on getting things to the right layer. So that's what I have for week 5. We'll see you in class, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.